My father is not the kind of man who raises his voice. In 40 years of business, in 40 years of living, I had never once heard him shout. Not when the rain flooded our shop in 2004 and destroyed 3 months of stock. Not when his business partner absconded to Abuja with their shared capital. Not even the night my mother called him from the hospital to tell him she had lost the pregnancy, the third one before me finally held. He was not a quiet man because he had nothing to say. He was quiet because he had learned something most men never do, that the loudest response to pain is not always a shout. Sometimes it is a prayer whispered into cupped hands at 4 in the morning, when the house is still and God is listening. I was 15 years old when Emeka disappeared. His full name was Emeka Okafor, though everyone in our compound called him by what he was, Nnewi. My father's apprentice. He had come to us from Nnewi at the age of 17, sent by his uncle with a small bag and a letter folded into quarters, asking my father to take the boy under his wing. My father ran a hardware distribution business in Onitsha: pipes, fittings, roofing sheets, electrical supplies, modest by the standards of the big traders, but solid. Respectable. Built over 20 years of honesty and early mornings. Emeka lived with us for 4 years. He ate at our table. He called my mother Mama. He taught me how to play draft on a board he made himself from cardboard and bottle caps. On Sundays after church, he would sit with my father on the veranda and listen, really listen, while my father talked about business, about integrity, about the kind of man a man should choose to become before the world chooses for him. My father trusted Emeka the way you trust someone you have watched grow. That was his only mistake. It happened on a Thursday in March. My father had just completed a major supply contract, roofing materials for a new secondary school being constructed in Awka. The payment had come in full, 52 million naira, the largest single transaction of his career. He had sent Emeka to make the bank deposit, a thing he had done dozens of times before with smaller amounts, always faithfully, always with the receipt in hand by noon. Noon came. Then 2 o'clock. Then 5. Emeka did not return. My father called the bank. The money had never arrived. He called Emeka's phone, switched off. He called the uncle in Nnewi, the number rang and rang. He drove to the bus park, to the motor park, to every place a young man running might pass through. Nothing. By nightfall, it was clear. Emeka was gone. And he had taken everything with him. I remember that night with a precision that still disturbs me. My mother sat at the kitchen table and wept in the way women weep when they are trying not to frighten their children, silently, into the fold of her wrapper, her shoulders moving in small, controlled shudders. My younger sister, who was 9, had fallen asleep on the couch without knowing anything had changed. I sat in the doorway between the parlor and the kitchen, old enough to understand, young enough to still believe that my father would fix it. He came home around 10. He sat down. He removed his cap. He placed it on his knee and looked at it for a long time, as if the cap had something to tell him. Then he looked at my mother and said, quietly, "We will be fine." That was all. Later, I crept to the window of my parents' room. I could see the outline of my father kneeling beside the bed, his forehead pressed to his clasped hands. I could not hear the words. But I watched him pray for a long time, and when he finally rose and lay down, I noticed something that confused me then and has never left me since. He was not crying. He looked like a man who had just set down something heavy. Relieved, almost. I asked him about it years later. He told me he had spent that hour praying, but not for what I might have expected. He had not prayed for the money to return. He had not prayed for Emeka to be caught or punished. He had prayed, he said, that wherever the boy was, God would not let him destroy himself with what he had done. That somewhere in the running, something would stop him. That the guilt would not eat him to nothing before mercy found him. I was not a saint, my father told me. I was angry. But I knew that if I cursed that boy, I would spend the rest of my life carrying the curse inside me. And I had a family to carry instead. The years that followed were not gentle. The 52 million naira was not simply a large sum, it was the sum. It was what my father had planned to use to retire the remaining loan on our family property, to expand the business, to finally breathe. Without it, he was exposed. The bank came. The interest came. The creditors came, patient at first, then less so. He sold the shop in Onitsha. He sold the Hilux he had bought himself as a 45th birthday gift. He restructured. He downsized. He started again, smaller, from a zinc shed in the market with 2 boys he paid weekly. My mother began selling fried fish and akara at the junction near our street to supplement. She never complained, not once, not aloud, but I washed her hands at the end of each evening, cozened by the oil and the fire, and I understood what a family pays when one man's treachery meets another man's trust. I went to university on a partial scholarship. I worked. I sent money home when I could. We managed. But the house, the one my grandfather had built in the village, the one my father had renovated and registered and mortgaged only slightly, the one with my grandmother's guava tree in the compound, the house was now in danger. The bank had been patient for a decade. Their patience had ended. The letter came on a Monday. Final notice of foreclosure. The outstanding amount, with interest accumulated over years of deferred payment, had grown to something that felt impossible. My father called me. His voice, as always, was steady. But I had learned by then to hear what lived beneath the steadiness, the quiet, controlled fear of a man who has never stopped trying and cannot understand why trying has not been enough. I drove home that weekend. We sat at the same table where my mother had wept the night Emeka disappeared. The letter was between us. We talked about options, each one smaller than the last. My sister, now a graduate, had a little saved. I had a little. My father had the small proceeds from the shed business, the loyal customers who had stayed with him through everything. Together, it was not enough. Not nearly. We prayed before I left. My father held my hand and my sister's hand and bowed his head and gave the whole problem to God with the same unceremonious, matter-of-fact trust with which he had always done it. No performance. No desperation. Just a man talking to someone he had decided, a long time ago, to believe. I drove back to Lagos with a stone in my chest. 3 weeks later, a black Mercedes SUV with Abuja plates turned into our village road and stopped at my father's gate. My mother was the one who came out first. She told me later that she almost did not recognize him, taller, broader, dressed in a fitted agbada of deep navy, a beard now where there used to be only a boy's clean face. But the eyes were the same. Emeka's eyes. Still nervous. Still watching for something. He had found them through the parish. He had called the church where my father had worshipped for 30 years, spoken to the pastor, explained, without explaining too much, that he was an old family friend trying to locate Mr. Okonkwo. The pastor had given him the village address without suspicion, because my father was a man about whom no one had suspicion. My mother did not shout. She did not run. She stood at the gate and looked at him for a long moment, and then she stepped aside and said, "Come and greet your ogre." My father was in the parlor when Emeka walked in. He looked up from the newspaper he was reading. He still read newspapers, the physical kind, every morning, and he saw the man standing in his doorway. He set the paper down slowly. He rose. What passed between them in those first seconds, I cannot tell you, because I was not there. My mother told me, and she is not a dramatic woman, so I trust her account. My father stood, and Emeka fell to his knees on the parlor floor before a single word was spoken, and the sound that came out of him was not a sentence. It was something older and more broken than language. He wept the way men weep when they have been holding something for 10 years and can no longer hold it. My father crossed the room. He placed his hand on Emeka's head. And he said, "My mother heard this clearly. Get up, my son. Get up." Emeka told his story over 2 hours, seated across from my father with a bottle of malt he barely touched. He had run to Lagos with the money. He had told himself he would invest it, double it, return it without anyone knowing the difference, the lie every thief tells themselves on the first day of their running. But money that arrives without righteousness does not stay. He had lost half of it in a failed partnership within 6 months. He had spent another portion surviving, hiding, becoming someone new in a city that asked no questions. He had hit the lowest point of his life, he said, in a single-room apartment in Mushin, broke, with the remaining scraps of stolen money running out, when something happened that he still could not fully explain. He woke one night in a cold sweat, certain, the way you are certain in dreams that have the texture of something more, that my father was praying for him. Not cursing him. Praying for him. He said it was the most frightening thing he had ever felt. He lay on the floor of that room and made a decision that he had spent the next 9 years keeping. He would not die as what he had become. He would build. He would pay it back. Every naira. With interest. And then he would come back and look the man in the eye and say the words that 10 years of shame had kept locked in his throat. He had built construction supplies, then contracting, then project management. He had found one honest partner, then 2. He had worked with the obsessive, almost violent focus of a man running towards something rather than away from it. By year 6, he had cleared his first 100 million. By year 9, he had a company with federal contracts. He opened a bag that he had placed beside his chair when he sat down. Inside it were 2 things, a certified bank draft for the exact amount of the original theft, 52 million naira, and a separate draft for the outstanding balance on the family property, paid in full, with a letter of instruction to the bank already signed and processed through his legal team. He slid them both across the table. My father looked at them for a long time without touching them. Then he looked at Emeka and said, "How is your soul?" Emeka blinked. Of all the things he had prepared himself for, anger, conditions, demands, he had not prepared for that question. "I am working on it, sir," he said finally. "Good," my father said. "That is the one I care about most." He called me that evening. I was in Lagos, in the middle of something that immediately ceased to matter. "Emeka came," he said. I gripped the phone. "What?" "He came, my son. He brought everything back. The house is safe." A pause. "Are you there?" I was there. I simply could not speak. "I told you," he said, and there was something in his voice I had heard before, not triumph, not vindication, but the deep, settled satisfaction of a man who had planted something in the dark, in faith, and had lived long enough to see it break the surface. "I told you that God does not forget." I have been thinking about that story for the last several weeks because of something my father said when I visited him last Christmas. We were sitting on the veranda, the same veranda where he used to sit with young Emeka on Sunday afternoons, and I asked him the question I had carried for 20 years. I asked him how he had done it. How he had knelt beside that bed on the worst night of his life and prayed for the person who had just ruined him. He thought about it for a while. "You know," he said, "I almost didn't. My first thought was to curse him. I will not lie to you, the words were already forming." He shook his head slowly. "But then I thought about what a curse costs the man who speaks it. You think you are throwing it outward. But a curse lives in the mouth that made it. It needs a home, and it will stay in yours if the other person does not receive it." He turned and looked at me directly. I chose not to pay that price. Whatever Emeka had taken from me in money, I refused to let him take from me in spirit. So I prayed for him instead. Not because I was a good man, I was furious. But because I was a smart one. He smiled at his own words. My father, at 68, still smiling at the things that cost him nothing anymore. Forgiveness is not a gift you give the person who wronged you, he said. It is a gate you open for yourself. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, what you release comes back to find you. Emeka visited again at Christmas. He is part of what I can only call our extended family now, present at the awkward, comfortable, overlapping way that people become family not by blood but by the long passage of shared time and survived pain. He brought his wife and his 2 children. His daughter, who is 7, has his same nervous eyes but her mother's laugh, which is frequent and unguarded. She spent the afternoon following my father around the compound with the particular devotion of a child who recognizes, without being able to name it, that she is in the presence of something worth staying near. At some point I found them together at my grandmother's guava tree, my father pointing up at the fruit, the little girl on her tiptoes, and I stood far enough away that they could not see me watching. I was thinking about seeds. About the fact that my father planted something in a dark moment, when he had every right to plant something else, and that the thing he chose to plant was small and invisible and probably felt, at the time, like the least useful response to devastation. And yet, here was the tree. Here was the shade. Here was the child, reaching. If you have someone in your life who took from you time, money, love, opportunity, and the temptation to carry that theft as a permanent wound has become heavier than you knew wounds could be, I want to offer you my father's story not as instruction but as evidence. Evidence that the prayer you pray in your darkest room does not dissolve into the ceiling. Evidence that the anger you choose not to weaponize becomes, in time, a different kind of strength. Evidence that forgiveness is not weakness dressed in religious language. It is a long-term investment in your own survival. In your own future. In the version of yourself that lives on the other side of what was done to you. My father lost 52 million naira in a single afternoon. He refused to lose himself along with it. And 10 years later, the boy who took the money came back to build a wall around everything my father had spent his life protecting. You cannot plan for that. You can only plant the seed, water it with prayer, and trust, the stubborn, unreasonable, thoroughly irrational trust of people who have decided to believe that the forest will come. Share this story if it touched you. Someone in your circle is carrying a wound they have not yet decided to release. Let them know what was planted in the dark can still bloom.